I'm Vivian Delaney, 72, and I thought I knew grief until I stood at my husband's funeral and heard his nephew whisper, "Gold digger," to the woman beside him. Harold had been gone for only 3 days, a sudden heart attack at 75, and, already, his family was painting me as the opportunistic widow who'd married their beloved uncle for his money. After 43 years of marriage, the accusation cut deeper than my loss. But what I discovered in the weeks that followed would shatter everything I thought I knew about the man I'd loved for nearly half a century. The truth wasn't just about Harold's hidden life, it was about thousands of people whose lives he'd quietly saved. A legacy that would change not just how I grieved, but how I understood the meaning of true wealth. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt judged in your darkest moment, like this video for a story about discovering that sometimes the people we love most are heroes in ways we never imagined. Harold's reading glasses sat on his nightstand, a simple pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that had perched on his nose every evening for the past 15 years. Now they seemed to mock me with their emptiness, reflecting the afternoon light streaming through our bedroom window. I picked them up, feeling the familiar weight in my palm, and wondered what secrets they had helped him read in those late-night hours when he thought I was asleep. The funeral had been a nightmare of whispered accusations and cold shoulders. Harold's nephew Marcus led the charge, his wife Jennifer nodding along as they painted me as the calculating woman who'd trapped their wealthy uncle. Wealthy, that was a laugh. Harold had lived modestly, driving the same pickup truck for 12 years, shopping at discount stores, and insisting we eat dinner at home most nights. If I was a gold digger, I'd certainly chosen the wrong mark. But the family saw something I apparently didn't. They remembered Harold before me. Before 1980, when a 29-year-old secretary named Vivian started working at his small accounting firm, I'd been fresh out of business school, eager to prove myself, and completely unprepared for the quiet kindness of my 46-year-old boss. Harold had been recently divorced, his first wife having left him for a younger man with prospects. We'd bonded over late nights balancing books and shared lunches in his cramped office. She saw an opportunity. I'd heard Marcus tell his cousin at the reception, Uncle Harold was vulnerable, and she swooped in. The words stung because they reduced our love story to a transaction. They erased the way Harold had courted me with handwritten notes slipped into my desk drawer, the way he'd nervously asked me to dinner 6 months after I'd started working for him, the way he'd waited another year before even attempting to kiss me. They forgot that I'd been the one with steady employment when his business struggled in the early 80s, that I'd worked 2 jobs to help pay for his mother's nursing home care. Standing in our bedroom now, surrounded by Harold's belongings, I felt the full weight of their judgment. 43 years of marriage reduced to mercenary calculation, 43 years of building a life together, of weathering his mother's disapproval, of trying unsuccessfully to have children, of growing old together, all of it dismissed as an elaborate con. I placed the glasses back on the nightstand and walked to his closet. His clothes still smelled like Old Spice aftershave and the faint scent of pipe tobacco he'd given up 20 years ago but never quite shook. I pressed my face into his favorite cardigan, the brown wool one I'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago, and finally allowed myself to cry. The tears weren't just for Harold anymore. They were for the loneliness that stretched ahead, for the family that had never truly accepted me, and for the growing suspicion that maybe I hadn't known my husband as well as I'd thought. 3 days after the funeral, I forced myself to enter Harold's study. The room had always been his sanctuary, a place where he'd retreat after dinner with a cup of coffee and whatever paperwork he'd brought home from the office. Even after he'd officially retired 5 years ago, he'd spent hours in here, claiming he was organizing old files or catching up on correspondence. Now, faced with the task of sorting through decades of accumulated papers, I realized how little I actually knew about Harold's daily activities. The desk was neat, as always, but the drawers were locked. I'd never thought to question why my husband kept his personal space so secure. In 43 years of marriage, I'd respected his privacy, just as he'd respected mine. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall like a steel sentinel, its 4 drawers secured with a combination lock I'd never seen Harold use. When had he installed this? I racked my brain, trying to remember when our old wooden filing cabinet had been replaced with this fortress-like structure. It must have been gradual. the way many changes in a long marriage happen so slowly you don't notice until one day you realize everything looks different. I started with the bookshelf, pulling down volumes of tax law and accounting principles, looking for anything that might give me insight into Harold's recent activities. Behind a particularly thick manual on estate planning, I found a manila envelope marked V important. My heart skipped. This was meant for me. Inside were copies of bank statements I'd never seen, showing accounts I didn't know existed. Harold had been far more successful than I'd realized. The modest lifestyle we'd maintained wasn't born of necessity, it was a choice. But why? And more puzzling, why were there regular monthly withdrawals of significant amounts, always marked as charitable donations but never itemized? I sat in Harold's leather chair, the one that still held the impression of his body, and tried to piece together the fragments of information, the mysterious phone calls that had increased in frequency over the past few years, the business trips that seemed odd for a retired accountant, the way he'd sometimes come home late, claiming he'd been helping a friend with some paperwork. The appointment card tucked into the corner of his desk blotter caught my attention. Jameson and Associates Estate Planning. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'd completely forgotten about the will reading in the chaos of funeral arrangements and family tensions. I prepared to leave the study. I noticed something else, a small key taped to the underside of Harold's desk drawer. My pulse quickened. Perhaps this was the key to understanding the man I'd shared my life with. The man whose family believed I'd married for money I'd never even known existed. The key felt warm in my palm, as if it held the power to unlock more than just a physical barrier. Whatever Harold had been hiding, whatever had required such secrecy, I was about to discover it, and something told me that when I did, everything I thought I knew about our marriage would change forever. Harold's last will and testament lay on the mahogany conference table like a roadmap to revelations I wasn't prepared for. The law office of Jameson and Associates felt intimidatingly formal, all leather-bound books and oil paintings of stern-faced judges. I sat across from Marcus, Jennifer, and Harold's two other surviving relatives, his cousin Dorothy and her son, Paul, feeling like a defendant facing a jury. Attorney Robert Jameson, a silver-haired man who'd apparently known Harold for decades, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. Before we begin, I want to express my condolences. Harold was not just a client but a dear friend, and his passing is a tremendous loss. Marcus shifted impatiently in his chair. Can we get on with it? We all know Uncle Harold was comfortable, but we need to discuss the house, the business assets, and, actually, Jameson interrupted gently, I think you'll find Harold's estate considerably more complex than you might expect. He opened the will and began reading the formal language, but the numbers he mentioned made my head spin. Properties I'd never heard of, investment accounts worth hundreds of thousands, and business interests that seemed to span multiple states. Harold hadn't just been comfortable, he'd been wealthy. Very wealthy. The house and primary residence go to my beloved wife, Vivian, Jameson read, and I felt the family's eyes boring into me, as do the contents therein, and the primary savings account. But then came the surprises. To the Sanctuary Solutions Foundation, I leave the sum of $2 million to continue the work we've begun. Sanctuary Solutions. I'd never heard Harold mention any foundation. To Safe Harbor House in Phoenix, $500,000 for operational expenses, another organization I didn't recognize. To Margaret Chen, my business partner and dear friend, $100,000 and full ownership of our shared commercial properties. Margaret Chen, in 43 years of marriage, Harold had never mentioned anyone by that name. I felt heat creeping up my neck as the family's shocked silence filled the room. Marcus was the first to speak. Business partner. What business partner? Uncle Harold was an accountant. Jameson continued reading a list of beneficiaries that seemed to go on forever. Women's shelters in 3 states. Legal aid societies. Organizations with names like New Beginnings and Safe Passage, each receiving substantial sums that added up to millions of dollars. The remaining assets, Jameson concluded, including the investment portfolio and retirement accounts, are left to my wife Vivian, with the understanding that she will continue the charitable work detailed in the attached letter. He handed me a sealed envelope marked for Vivian's eyes only in Harold's familiar handwriting. The room erupted. Marcus stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. This is impossible. Where did all this money come from? And who is Margaret Chen? Jennifer's voice was shrill with accusation. She knew about this. She had to know. No one stays married to someone for 43 years without knowing they're worth millions. I didn't know, I said quietly, but my voice was lost in the chaos of their outrage. Dorothy, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward. Robert, is this will legitimate? Can it be contested? Jameson nodded gravely. It's perfectly legal and properly executed. Harold updated it just 6 months ago. He was very specific about his wishes. The family continued their heated discussion, but I found myself staring at the envelope in my hands. Harold's final words to me, explanations for a life I was only now discovering he'd lived. Whatever was in this letter would either vindicate me or confirm their worst suspicions. As we left the office, Marcus grabbed my arm. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Vivian, but we're going to find out what really happened to Uncle Harold's money. I pulled away from his grip. Maybe you should be asking what Harold was doing with his money, not what I was doing with Harold. Harold's handwritten letter to me trembled in my hands as I sat in my kitchen, the familiar space feeling foreign after the revelations of the will reading. The envelope was thick, filled with pages of Harold's careful script, and I could almost hear his voice in the measured way he'd formed each word. My dearest Vivian, it began. If you're reading this, then I've left you to face questions I should have answered while I was alive. Please forgive me for the secrets I've kept, but know that every choice I made was to protect you and the people whose lives depended on discretion. I took a shaky breath and continued reading. 43 years ago, I married the most extraordinary woman I'd ever met. You brought light into my world after my first marriage ended, and you've been my anchor through everything that followed. But there's a part of my life I've kept separate from you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I loved you too much to put you in danger. Danger? What danger could Harold, a mild-mannered accountant, have possibly faced? The work began 15 years ago when a young woman named Sarah came to my office. She was bruised, terrified, and desperate for help hiding money from her abusive husband. I helped her open a separate account, and when she disappeared one night with her 2 children, I thought that was the end of it. But word spreads in certain circles, and soon other women were coming to me, women who needed more than financial advice. They needed to disappear. I set the letter down, my hands shaking. Harold had been helping abuse victims. Why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't he asked for my help? I want you to know that everything I did was legal, though it operated in the shadows of the law. I worked with police, social workers, and a network of people who believed, as I did, that sometimes the system fails those who need it most. We created safe houses, new identities, and fresh starts for women and children who had nowhere else to turn. The letter went on to describe Project Sanctuary, a network Harold had helped establish and fund. Margaret Chen was his business partner, a former social worker who'd coordinated the actual relocations while Harold provided the financial backing and legitimate business front. I know you're wondering why I kept this from you. The truth is, Vivian, some of the men these women were fleeing from are dangerous, violent, well-connected, or both. I received threats over the years, and I lived with the constant fear that someone might try to hurt you to get to me. Keeping you unaware was my way of keeping you safe. Tears blurred my vision as I read about the woman who'd been stalked by her ex-husband for 2 years before Harold's network helped her disappear, the teenage girl who'd been trafficked by her own family, the dozens of children who were now safe because Harold had funded their escape and relocation. I estimate that over the past 15 years, we've directly helped over 800 women and children escape dangerous situations, but the ripple effects, the children who grew up safe, the women who rebuilt their lives, the families they've formed, that number reaches into the thousands. The final paragraph made me sob openly. I know my family will question where the money came from, and they'll probably blame you. The truth is, I was more successful in business than I let anyone know. I invested wisely, lived modestly, and poured my profits into this work. It became my calling, my purpose, and my greatest joy, second only to loving you. I'm leaving you a choice, my darling. You can close this chapter of my life and live comfortably on what remains, or you can meet with Margaret and learn about the work we've been doing. Either way, know that you've been the love of my life, and everything I did was made possible by the stability and happiness you gave me. The letter was signed simply, "Forever yours, Harold." I sat in my kitchen as the afternoon light faded, holding the letter to my chest. My husband hadn't been having an affair or hiding gambling debts. He'd been a hero, saving lives while I'd been completely oblivious. The modest lifestyle, the secretive phone calls, the late nights, it had all been in service of something greater than himself. And now his family was calling me a gold digger for inheriting money he'd earned through legitimate business and spent on saving lives. The irony was almost too much to bear. The business card for Sanctuary Solutions was tucked behind Harold's driver's license in his wallet. A simple white card with elegant black lettering that I'd somehow never noticed during all the times I'd reached for cash or credit cards over the years. Margaret Chen, Executive Director, with a phone number and an address in downtown Phoenix, 40 minutes from our suburban home. I turned the card over in my fingers, studying the small logo of a stylized door opening to reveal a sunrise. How many times had Harold pulled out his wallet in my presence, and how had I never seen this? The answer was obvious. Harold had been deliberately careful, protecting both his secret work and me from knowledge that could have put us both at risk. After reading his letter 3 times, I'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with the decision he'd left me. I could walk away, live comfortably on the inheritance, and let Project Sanctuary continue without me. Or I could honor Harold's request and learn about the work that had consumed so much of his time and resources. By morning, the choice was clear. I needed to understand what my husband had been doing with 15 years of his life. The address led me to a modest office building wedged between a coffee shop and a used bookstore. The directory in the lobby listed Sanctuary Solutions on the 3rd floor, described simply as consulting services. I climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, not sure what I'd find or how I'd be received. The woman who answered my knock was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 50, with graying black hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to assess me instantly. She was attractive in an understated way, dressed in a simple blue blouse and black slacks that suggested competence rather than fashion. "You must be Vivian," she said, before I could introduce myself. "I'm Margaret Chen. Harold described you perfectly." Her office was spartanly furnished, but somehow welcoming, with a few plants on the windowsill and photographs on her desk that showed children and families, though I couldn't tell if they were personal photos or professional ones. Margaret gestured for me to sit in one of 2 chairs facing her desk. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she continued, settling across from me. "Harold was not just my business partner, but one of the finest men I've ever known. His death has left a hole in more lives than you can imagine." "I read his letter," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea about any of this. 15 years, and I never suspected. Margaret nodded with understanding rather than surprise. "Harold was very good at compartmentalizing. It's a necessary skill in this work. He kept you separate to keep you safe, but also because he knew that if you discovered what we were doing, you'd want to help, and that would have made you a target." She opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "Would you like to see what Harold accomplished? Would you like to understand what your husband's legacy really is?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Margaret opened the folder and pulled out a photograph album. "These are some of the families Harold helped save." The photo album of rescued families sat heavy in my lap as Margaret turned each page with reverent care. Each photograph told a story of transformation. Before and after shots that showed the stark contrast between desperation and hope, fear and freedom. "This is Maria Santos," Margaret said, pointing to a picture of a young Hispanic woman with 2 small children. Her husband had connections to a drug cartel and had threatened to kill her and take the children to Mexico if she ever tried to leave. Harold funded her relocation to Portland, where she's now a certified nursing assistant. Her children are honor students. The next page showed an older woman with teenage daughters, Patricia Williams. Her ex-husband was a police officer who used his connections to track her every time she tried to escape. He'd beaten her so severely that she'd lost hearing in one ear. Harold arranged for new identities and a relocation to Seattle. She now runs a small bakery. Each story was more harrowing than the last. And yet, each ended with hope: children safe in new schools, women rebuilding their lives, families free from the terror that had defined their existence. Harold hadn't just given them money. He'd given them their lives back. "How did it work?" I asked, struggling to understand the logistics of such an operation. Margaret closed the album and leaned back in her chair. "Harold was the financial backbone, but we had a network of people in various professions. Lawyers who specialized in name changes and sealed records, social workers who could navigate the system quickly, safe house operators who provided temporary shelter, even a few sympathetic law enforcement officers who would look the other way when necessary. She pulled out a map of the southwestern United States, dotted with red pins. These are our safe houses, places where women and children could stay while we arranged permanent relocations. Harold personally funded the purchase and maintenance of 12 properties across 3 states. I stared at the map, realizing that Harold had essentially run a private witness protection program. What about the dangerous men? The ones who were looking for these women? Margaret's expression darkened. That was the most challenging part. Some of these men had resources, money, connections, or simply the persistence to keep hunting. We had to be extremely careful about our security protocols. Harold received threats over the years, which is why he insisted on keeping you completely out of it. She opened another file and showed me copies of police reports. This man stalked one of our clients for 18 months after she disappeared. He hired private investigators, threatened Harold's business, even tried to break into his office. That's when Harold upgraded his home security and started varying his daily routines. The pieces of Harold's behavior over the past few years suddenly made sense. The new alarm system he'd insisted on installing, the way he'd started taking different routes to familiar places, the subtle changes I'd attributed to aging or mild paranoia were actually security measures protecting both of us. How many people did Harold help? I asked. Margaret consulted a thick ledger. Direct rescues. 843 women and children over 15 years. But if you count the children who grew up safe, the new families these women formed, the ripple effects of their freedom, we estimate Harold's work touched over 3,000 lives. 3,000 lives. My quiet, modest husband had saved 3,000 people while I'd been completely oblivious, worried about whether we could afford to replace our aging dishwasher. The hardest part for Harold, Margaret continued, was balancing the urgency of the work with the need for security. Every rescue was a calculated risk. Every new client was a potential threat if they were being followed or if their story wasn't what it seemed. She showed me a photograph of Harold at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony, standing next to a young woman in a cap and gown. This is Sarah, the first woman Harold helped 15 years ago. She earned her nursing degree last year. Her children are now in college. She credits Harold with giving her the chance to become the person she was meant to be. Looking at Harold's proud smile in the photograph, I finally understood what had been missing from our marriage: not love or companionship, but purpose. While I'd been content with our quiet domestic life, Harold had been fighting a private war against injustice, one family at a time. He talked about you constantly, Margaret said softly. How proud he was of you, how much he loved you, how difficult it was to keep this secret. He said you would have wanted to help, and that's exactly why he couldn't tell you. The detailed map with red pins showed Harold's network spread across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, each pin representing a safe house where desperate families had found temporary refuge. Margaret suggested we visit the closest one, a modest ranch house in a quiet Phoenix suburb that looked completely unremarkable from the outside. This is intentional, Margaret explained as we pulled into the driveway. The houses need to blend in. Nothing that would attract attention or suggest anything unusual is happening inside. The woman who answered the door was in her 30s, with kind eyes and a wariness that spoke of personal experience with danger. I'm Linda, she said, extending her hand. Margaret told me you were Harold's wife. I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good man. Inside, the house was furnished simply but comfortably, with child safety features that weren't immediately obvious until you looked closely: outlet covers, cabinet locks, and toys arranged in designated play areas. It felt more like a family home than a shelter, which I realized was exactly the point. We have 3 families staying with us right now, Linda explained, leading us to the kitchen where a young woman sat at the table helping 2 children with what appeared to be homework. Sarah, I'd like you to meet someone. Sarah looked up, and I was struck by how young she was, probably in her early 20s. With blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and bruises on her arms that makeup couldn't quite cover. The children beside her, a boy and a girl who couldn't have been older than 6 and 4, watched us with the guarded expressions of children who'd learned too early not to trust strangers. Sarah and her children arrived 3 days ago, Margaret said gently. Her husband found them at the last safe house, so we had to move them quickly. He's a truck driver, Sarah said quietly, not meeting my eyes. He knows the highways, has friends all over the place. Every time I think we're safe, he finds us somehow. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was the reality Harold had been dealing with, the constant danger, the knowledge that one mistake could cost lives. "How long have you been running?" I asked. 8 months, Sarah replied. "But Mr. Harold," Margaret said, "he has a new plan, something permanent this time." Margaret nodded. "We're arranging new identities for Sarah and the children. Complete documentation, birth certificates, social security numbers, school records." Harold had connections with people who specialize in creating clean backgrounds that will stand up to investigation. The scope of Harold's operation was staggering. This wasn't just about hiding people temporarily. It was about erasing their old lives and creating entirely new ones. The legal and financial complexities alone must have been enormous. Yet Harold had managed it all while maintaining his cover as a simple retired accountant. How much did Harold spend on each case? I asked Margaret as we toured the rest of the house. It varied. A simple relocation might cost $15,000, transportation, temporary housing, basic documentation. But complex cases like Sarah's, where we need complete identity changes and long-term support, could run $50,000 or more. $50,000 per family. If Harold had helped over 800 people, the mathematics were staggering. No wonder he'd been so careful about maintaining his modest lifestyle. Every dollar saved was another life that could be rescued in the backyard. We met another resident, an older Hispanic woman named Carmen, who was hanging laundry while keeping an eye on several children playing in a sandbox Harold had apparently installed personally. "Center Harold," Carmen said when Margaret introduced me, crossing herself reverently. "He came here 2 months ago to fix the air conditioning when it broke. He didn't just send someone, he came himself, brought tools, stayed until it was working again." The image of Harold, dressed in his weekend clothes, crawling around in an attic to repair an air conditioner for strangers, brought tears to my eyes. This was the man I'd married, practical, caring, willing to get his hands dirty to help others, but I'd never known the full extent of his generosity. "He always asked about the children," Carmen continued, "brought toys, books, wanted to know if they felt safe, if they were sleeping well. He understood that the little ones suffer most when families are broken." As we prepared to leave, Sarah approached me hesitantly. "Mrs. Delaney, I just wanted to say thank you. I know you didn't know about what your husband was doing, but you shared him with us all these years. That's a sacrifice, even if you didn't know you were making it." Her words stayed with me as we drove back to Margaret's office. I had shared Harold with hundreds of desperate families, giving up time and attention I'd never known I was missing. Yet somehow, it didn't feel like a loss. Instead, it felt like an honor. The police report Margaret showed me was dated 6 months ago, filed by Harold under an incident number I'd never seen on any paperwork in our house. Detective Raymond Martinez had taken Harold's statement about threatening phone calls and suspicious vehicles parked near our home surveillance that I'd apparently been too trusting or naive to notice. Subject reports: escalating harassment, related to his assistance with domestic violence cases. The report read, "Threats include specific details about his home address, daily routines, and family members. Subject has implemented additional security measures and requests increased patrol presence in his neighborhood. Family members." That meant me. Someone had threatened me, and Harold had never said a word. Margaret spread out additional police reports across her desk like a grim timeline of escalation. This started about 2 years ago when Harold helped relocate a woman whose ex-husband had connections to organized crime. The man was furious about losing access to his wife and children, and he blamed Harold for stealing his family. The next report detailed vandalism to Harold's office windows, broken, threatening messages spray-painted on the building. I remembered Harold mentioning vandalism problems in the commercial district, but he'd made it sound like random crime, not targeted harassment. "Harold never told you about any of this?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Nothing. I had no idea." I felt a mixture of gratitude and anger, grateful that Harold had protected me from fear, angry that he'd carried this burden alone. "What kind of threats did he receive?" Margaret hesitated before opening another file. "These are transcripts of recorded phone calls. Harold started recording them after the police advised him to document everything." I read the typed pages with growing horror. The threats weren't just against Harold, they included detailed descriptions of what the caller would do to me if Harold didn't mind his own business. The language was vulgar and specific. describing violence that made my stomach turn. This caller knew our daily routines, I said, pointing to a transcript where the threatener mentioned my Tuesday afternoon grocery shopping and Thursday evening book club. He was watching our house. Harold hired a private security company to conduct counter-surveillance, Margaret explained. They identified at least 3 different men who had been observing your neighborhood at various times. That's when Harold installed the new alarm system and started varying his routes. Another report described a break-in attempt at our home while we'd been attending a neighbor's retirement party. The would-be intruder had been scared off by the alarm system, but not before leaving a threatening note tucked under our windshield wiper. Harold had found it when we returned home, told me it was probably just kids, and disposed of it before I could read it. The most serious incident happened 4 months ago, Margaret continued, pulling out a thick report with crime scene photographs. Harold was leaving the office late one evening when 2 men confronted him in the parking lot. They demanded he stop helping their women and made it clear they knew where we lived, where I worked, even where our dentist's office was located. The photographs showed Harold's car with slashed tires and broken windows. I remembered that evening Harold had come home in a taxi, claiming his car had been vandalized while he was having dinner with an old client. He'd seemed shaken but had attributed it to being the victim of random crime in a bad neighborhood. Harold fought back, I asked, noting the police report mentioned a physical altercation. Your husband was tougher than he looked, Margaret said, with a sad smile. He managed to get to his car alarm, which scared them off, but not before one of them made it very clear that next time, they might visit his pretty wife instead of bothering with him directly. The room seemed to spin around me. For months, Harold had been living with the knowledge that violent criminals were watching our home, tracking our movements, and planning ways to hurt me in order to stop his rescue work. Every kiss goodbye, every normal evening at home, every mundane interaction had been shadowed by his awareness of the danger surrounding us. Why didn't he stop? I asked. If it was so dangerous, why didn't he just walk away? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Because Harold understood something that took me years to learn in this work. Every day he hesitated, every rescue he postponed, every time he chose safety over action, someone else suffered. The woman who called us last week had been beaten so severely she couldn't see out of her left eye. Her 3-year-old daughter hasn't spoken since witnessing the attack. Harold couldn't live with himself if he abandoned people like that. She pulled out one final report, the police statement filed the day before Harold's heart attack. A woman named Jennifer Polk had contacted Harold's office, desperate for help escaping her husband, a man with a history of violence and the resources to track her anywhere she tried to hide. Harold died the day after agreeing to help Jennifer, Margaret said quietly. His last act was authorizing the funds for her relocation. She and her 2 children are safe now, but Harold never got to see them reach their new home. Looking at the police reports spread across Margaret's desk, I finally understood the weight Harold had carried. He'd been a warrior in a secret war, protecting not just the families he rescued, but also protecting me from the knowledge of how dangerous that war had become. Harold's coded address book was a masterpiece of careful discretion, filled with names and numbers that meant nothing to casual observers, but represented a vast network of people committed to saving lives. Margaret and I spent the afternoon in her office deciphering Harold's system initials and symbols that corresponded to different types of assistance, geographic locations, and levels of security clearance. See this entry, Dr. R.C. Phoenix I. Margaret pointed to a line that looked like medical gibberish. That's Dr. Rebecca Chen, a plastic surgeon who donates her services to help abuse victims change their appearance. The I indicates she specializes in facial reconstruction, particularly around the orbital bones where many women sustain repeated injuries. The address book contained over 200 contacts spread across multiple states, lawyers who specialized in name changes and sealed records, counselors who provided trauma therapy, even a few judges who could expedite certain legal proceedings when lives were at stake. Harold had built this network methodically over 15 years, cultivating relationships with people who shared his commitment to justice. How did Harold find all these people? I asked, marveling at the scope of the operation. Carefully, Margaret replied, sometimes through referrals from other network members, sometimes by observing who showed up consistently to help abuse victims. Through traditional channels, Harold had a talent for identifying people who would go the extra mile, even when it meant bending rules or taking personal risks. She showed me entries for safe house operators across 3 states. Look at this. Grandmother T, Santa Fe Quilts. That's Teresa Martinez, a retired teacher who runs a safe house disguised as a bed and breakfast. Women arrive as guests and leave with new identities and fresh starts. The quilts reference her cover story about teaching quilting workshops. Other entries were more cryptic. Uncle Jay documents Denver Mountain. That's James Crawford, a former government employee who handles the technical aspects of identity creation. He works out of a cabin in the mountains where he can't be easily circled. Margaret pulled out her own phone and dialed one of the numbers from Harold's book. Dr. Patricia Williams. This is Margaret Chen. I'm calling because Harold Delaney passed away last week. She listened for a moment, then covered the phone. She wants to know if we're continuing operations. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of loyalty Harold had inspired throughout his network. Dr. Williams, a psychiatrist who provided pro bono counseling to rescued families, had treated over 60 of Harold's referrals. She offered to continue her services and asked if there was anything she could do to help maintain the network's operations. That's been the response from everyone, Margaret said after ending the call. Harold didn't just coordinate this network, he inspired it. People trusted him completely because he never asked anyone to take risks. He wasn't taking himself. She showed me a detailed organizational chart Harold had created, mapping the network's capabilities and geographic coverage. It looked like something from a corporate boardroom or military planning sessions, sophisticated, thorough, and designed for maximum efficiency with minimal exposure. The genius of Harold's system was compartmentalization, Margaret explained. No single person knew the entire network. Each contact knew only what they needed to know to perform their specific role. That way, if anyone was compromised, they couldn't endanger the whole operation. But Harold had known everything. He'd been the central hub that connected all the spokes, the one person who understood how each piece fit into the larger mission. Without him, the network was like a symphony. Without a conductor roll, the instruments were still there. But no one knew how to coordinate the music. How do we keep this going? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what Harold had managed. Margaret smiled for the first time since I'd met her. We learned. Harold left detailed procedures for everything: how to vet new clients, how to assess security risks, how to coordinate with law enforcement when necessary. He was preparing for this possibility, though I don't think he expected it to happen so soon. She pulled out a thick manual Harold had created, labeled Operational Procedures Sanctuary Solutions. It was hundreds of pages long, covering everything from financial protocols to emergency evacuation plans. Harold had literally written the playbook for continuing his life's work. The hardest part won't be the logistics. Margaret continued. It'll be earning the trust Harold built over 15 years. These people didn't just respect his expertise, they loved him. He remembered birthdays, checked on families years after relocating them, attended graduations and weddings when it was safe to do so. Looking through Harold's address book, I began to understand that my husband hadn't just been running a rescue operation. He'd been building a family of hundreds of people united by their commitment to protecting the vulnerable and their affection for the quiet man who'd shown them what true heroism looked like. The network is Harold's real legacy, Margaret said. Not just the lives he saved, but the community of protectors he created. That's what we need to preserve. Harold's medical records told a story I wasn't prepared to hear. Dr. Samuel Rodriguez, Harold's cardiologist, had agreed to meet with me after I'd explained that I was trying to understand the circumstances surrounding my husband's death. Manila folder he placed on his desk contained 15 years of tests, treatments, and warnings that Harold had apparently kept from me. Your husband's heart condition wasn't sudden, Dr. Rodriguez said gently. He'd been managing coronary artery disease for over a decade. The stress of his work, and I understand now that his work was more demanding than I realized, was literally killing him. The EKG results showed progressive deterioration over the years, with significant spikes in cardiac stress markers during periods that corresponded exactly with major rescue operations. Harold's heart had been sending distress signals for years, signals he'd ignored in favor of saving others. I begged him to reduce his stress levels, Dr. Rodriguez continued. I prescribed medication, recommended lifestyle changes, even suggested he consider retirement. But Harold always said he had commitments he couldn't abandon. The final medical report, dated the day of Harold's death, painted a clear picture. Harold had experienced what the doctor called acute stress-induced myocardial infarction, a heart attack triggered by extreme emotional and physical stress. The timeline Margaret had provided showed exactly what that stress had been. Jennifer Polk had called Harold's office at 6:30 a.m., sobbing and desperate. Her husband had discovered her plans to leave and had beaten her so severely that she'd required emergency room treatment. He'd then taken their 2 children and disappeared, threatening to kill them all if she involved the police. Jennifer was hiding in a women's shelter, but her husband had connections. He'd found her at shelters before. Harold had spent the morning coordinating an emergency response. According to Margaret's records, he'd made 17 phone calls in 3 hours, arranging safe transportation, emergency housing, and coordination with sympathetic law enforcement officers who could help recover the children without alerting the abusive father. The rescue operation was successful. Margaret had told me when she'd provided the timeline. We got Jennifer and her children to safety by 2 p.m. But Harold called me around 3 o'clock, saying he felt wrung out and was going home early. He'd driven himself home, parked in our garage, and made it as far as the kitchen before collapsing. By the time I'd found him 20 minutes later, returning from my weekly visit to the library, it was too late. The paramedics said he'd probably died within minutes of the heart attack. The irony, Dr. Rodriguez said, closing Harold's file, is that your husband's heart was literally too big. The enlargement we'd been monitoring wasn't just from disease. It was from the constant flood of stress hormones his body produced every time he put himself in danger to help someone else. I thought about Harold's final day. The way he'd kissed me goodbye that morning with particular tenderness. The way he'd said, "I love you," Vivian, with unusual emphasis. Had he sensed something? Had his body been warning him that this rescue might be his last? Did he suffer? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The type of heart attack your husband experienced is typically quick, Dr. Rodriguez said kindly. Based on the paramedics' report and the position where you found him, he probably lost consciousness within seconds. His last thoughts were likely of you and the satisfaction of knowing he'd just saved another family. Margaret had told me about Jennifer's children, twin boys, age 7, who were now safe in a new city with new identities and the chance to grow up without fear. Harold's final act had been authorizing the emergency funds for their relocation, signing the papers even as his heart was failing. Your husband was a hero, Dr. Rodriguez said as I prepared to leave. I see many patients who extend their lives by avoiding stress, taking every precaution, focusing entirely on their own survival. Harold chose to spend his heart saving others. That's a choice few people have the courage to make. Walking to my car, I understood for the first time that Harold hadn't just died saving thousands of people over 15 years. He'd died in the act of saving one more family, giving everything he had, including his own life, to ensure that 2 little boys could grow up safe from violence. The gold digger accusations from his family seemed not just wrong now, but obscene. Harold hadn't left me money. He'd left me the knowledge that I'd been married to a man who'd literally given his life for strangers, who'd worn out his heart saving others while keeping me safe from the knowledge of what that sacrifice was costing him. The medical records made it clear. Harold's death wasn't a diet, was the inevitable end of a life lived with such fierce compassion that his body couldn't sustain it. He'd died the way he'd lived for 15 years, putting others' safety before his own survival. The thick folder of thank you letters Margaret brought to Harold's house was almost too heavy to lift. Hundreds of letters, cards, and photographs, accumulated over 15 years, each one representing a life Harold had touched, a family he'd saved, a future he'd made possible. I thought you should see these in your own home, Margaret said as we sat in my living room, the folder between us like a treasure chest of memories. Harold kept every single letter. He read them when the work got difficult, when he needed to remember why the risks were worth taking. The first letter I opened was written in a child's careful handwriting on notebook paper decorated with crayon drawings. Dear Mr. Harold, thank you for helping me and Mommy get away from the scary man. I like our new house and my new school. Love, Emma, age 7. Emma's letter was dated 8 years ago. I wondered if she was in high school now, if she remembered the scary man at all, or if Harold's intervention had faded into the background of a normal, safe childhood. The next letter was from a woman named Carol, thanking Harold for helping her relocate after her ex-husband had stalked her for 2 years. Because of you, I was able to finish nursing school and provide for my children. My daughter just graduated from college. the first person in our family to get a degree. None of this would have been possible without your courage and generosity. Letter after letter told similar stories. A woman who'd become a teacher after Harold helped her escape domestic violence. A teenager who'd been trafficked by her own family, now working as a social worker, helping other victims, children who'd grown up to have children of their own, extending Harold's impact into future generations. This one arrived just last week, Margaret said, handing me an envelope postmarked from Denver. It's from Sarah, the first woman Harold helped 15 years ago. Sarah's letter was typed on professional letterhead. She was now the director of a women's shelter, using her own experience and Harold's example to build a program that had helped over 300 families in the past 5 years. I heard about Harold's passing through our network, the letter read. I need you to know that he didn't just save my life and my children's lives. He showed me what true heroism looks like. Every woman I help, every child I rescue, every family I relocate is a testament to Harold's legacy. He taught me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to look away from suffering. Many letters included photographs, graduation ceremonies, weddings, new babies, families standing in front of new homes. Harold had been invited to dozens of these celebrations but had attended very few. Always concerned about security risks and maintaining operational secrecy. He framed this one, Margaret said, showing me a photo of a young woman in a cap and gown standing next to Harold at what appeared to be a college graduation. This is Maria Santos, the woman with cartel connections I showed you before. She became a nurse practitioner and now runs a clinic in Portland. Harold made an exception to attend her graduation because she said he was the only father figure she'd ever had. The mathematical reality of Harold's impact was staggering. If he'd directly helped 843 people over 15 years, and if each of those people had influenced an average of just 3 others through children they'd raised safely, friends they'd helped, or professional work they'd been able to pursue, then Harold's network of influence extended to nearly 3,000 lives. But the ripple effects went even further. Several letters were from children who'd been infants or toddlers when Harold rescued their families. Now teenagers or young adults. They wrote about becoming counselors, social workers, and advocates themselves, inspired by stories their mothers had told them about the mysterious man who'd given them a chance at normal lives. One letter particularly moved me, from a woman named Patricia who'd been helped by Harold 12 years ago. My son just enlisted in the army, she wrote. He says he wants to serve his country the way Mr. Harold served our family. He doesn't remember the violence from when he was little, but he remembers feeling safe when we moved to our new home. He wants to make other people feel that safe. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I was reading Harold's true autobiography, not the quiet life of a modest accountant, but the epic story of a man who'd waged a secret war against domestic violence and won battle after battle, one family at a time. How many of these people know about Harold's death? I asked Margaret. Word travels fast through the network, she replied. We've received over 50 calls in the past week from people wanting to attend a memorial service, wanting to contribute to continuing his work, wanting to share their stories publicly for the first time. I thought about the family members who'd called me a gold digger, who'd questioned Harold's wealth and my motives. They should see these letters, should understand that Harold's true fortune wasn't in bank accounts, but in the thousands of lives he'd transformed, the children who were growing up safe because of his courage, the women who were free because he'd refused to look away from their suffering. The bank statements I spread across Harold's dining room table told a story that would shatter his family's misconceptions forever. Marcus, Jennifer, Dorothy, and Paul sat in stunned silence as I walked them through 15 years of financial records that proved Harold's wealth hadn't come from mysterious sources. It had come from shrewd investments and a business acumen none of them had bothered to understand. These are Harold's investment statements, I said, pointing to documents showing consistent, conservative growth over decades. He started with the money from his first wife's life insurance settlement and built it through careful stock picks and real estate investments. Nothing flashy, nothing risky, just smart financial planning. Marcus picked up one of the statements, his face pale. I had no idea Uncle Harold was this sophisticated with money. None of you bothered to ask, I replied, allowing some steel into my voice. You all assumed he was just a simple accountant. But Harold was brilliant with finance. He could have been wealthy working for anyone, but he chose to use his skills for something more important. I showed them the charitable donation records, millions of dollars given away over the years, not to impress anyone or gain tax benefits, but to fund an operation that had saved hundreds of lives. The amounts were staggering, representing sometimes half of Harold's annual income. Sanctuary Solutions, Safe Harbor House, New Beginnings Coalition. Jennifer read from the donation list. What are all these organizations? They're the network Harold built to help domestic violence victims disappear, I said, watching their faces as the reality sank in. Your uncle wasn't just successful in business, he was a hero who saved thousands of people while you all sat around wondering why he didn't spend more money on himself. I pulled out Margaret's photo album and placed it in front of them. These are some of the families Harold rescued: women who were being beaten, children who were being abused, teenagers who were being trafficked. Harold gave them new lives, new identities, and the chance to be safe. Dorothy, who'd been silent until now, touched one of the photographs with a trembling finger. This little girl, she looks like my granddaughter. She's probably the same age your granddaughter was when Harold saved her from a father who was molesting her, I said bluntly. Harold arranged for her and her mother to disappear, gave them new names, and funded their relocation to a city where they could start over. The room fell silent except for the sound of Jennifer crying softly. Marcus cleared his throat several times before speaking. Vivian, I owe you an apology. We all do. I thought we thought Uncle Harold had been hiding money, and that you thought I was a gold digger who'd somehow manipulated a sweet old man. I finished for him. You thought I'd spent 43 years pretending to love him for his money I didn't even know existed. Paul, who'd been the quietest of the group, looked up from the financial records. These business trips Uncle Harold took, were those all rescue missions? I nodded. Every one. When he told us he was visiting clients or attending conferences, he was actually coordinating safe house relocations, meeting with abuse victims, or setting up new identities for families who needed to disappear. I showed them the police reports documenting the threats Harold had received, the evidence of surveillance, the break-in attempts. Your uncle lived with the constant threat of violence because violent men didn't like him helping their victims escape. He never told me any of this because he was protecting me. He never told you because he was protecting the operation. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking. I called you a gold digger at his funeral. I said horrible things about Uncle Harold's judgment, about your motives. God, what kind of man was I insulting? A hero, I said simply. A man who literally died saving people. His last act was authorizing funds to rescue a woman and her 2 children from a man who'd threatened to kill them. Harold's heart attack was triggered by the stress of that final rescue operation. Jennifer wiped her eyes and looked at the thank you letters I'd arranged around the photos. Can I read some of these? For the next hour, we sat together reading Harold's mail letters from women who'd become nurses, teachers, and social workers, because Harold had given them the chance to escape violence. Letters from children who were now adults, thanking the man who'd saved their childhoods. Letters from Harold's network partners, describing his courage, his generosity, and his unwavering commitment to justice. This woman says Uncle Harold attended her daughter's high school graduation, Dorothy said, holding up a letter with a photo attached. He drove 4 hours each way to be there because her daughter had written to say he was the only grandfather figure she'd ever known. Marcus returned to the table, his face wet with tears. I need to make this right somehow. What can we do to continue Uncle Harold's work? How can we honor what he built? You can start by treating me like family instead of like a criminal, I said, though my anger was fading as I watched their genuine remorse. And you can help me figure out how to keep Harold's network running. Margaret needs support, the safe houses need funding, and there are more families who need help. Paul picked up one of the bank statements. This shows Uncle Harold was planning to increase his donations next year. He was going to give away almost everything he had, because he understood what real wealth means, I said. It's not about what you accumulate, it's about what you give away to make the world better. Jennifer stood up and came around the table to hug me. I'm so sorry, Vivian. I'm sorry for what we said about you, and I'm sorry we never knew what an amazing man Uncle Harold was. As Harold's family finally began to understand the man they'd lost, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The gold digger accusations would stop, but more importantly, Harold's legacy would continue with the support of people who finally understood what he'd been fighting for. The journalist's business card that arrived in my mail. 3 weeks after Harold's death sent a chill down my spine. Rebecca Martinez, investigative reporter, Phoenix Tribune, with a handwritten note on the back. Mrs. Delaney, I'm investigating a story about your husband's humanitarian work. I'd like to speak with you about his legacy. I called Margaret immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. A reporter knows about Harold's work. She wants to interview me. We've been expecting this, Margaret said, though her voice was tense. Word has been spreading through the network since Harold's death. Some of the people he helped want to go public with their stories, and reporters are starting to connect the dots. Within an hour, Margaret was at my house with 2 other people I'd never met: a lawyer named David Kim, who specialized in protecting whistleblowers and activists, and a security consultant named Janet Torres, who'd worked with Harold to develop safety protocols for the network. The question isn't whether this story comes out, David explained as we sat in my living room. It's how it comes out, and whether we can control the narrative to protect ongoing operations. Rebecca Martinez's research was thorough. She'd identified connections between Harold's business, several safe houses, and a pattern of domestic violence cases where victims had vanished without a trace. She'd even found social media posts from some of the families Harold had helped, thanking a mysterious guardian angel who'd saved their lives. If we don't cooperate with her, she'll publish what she has, Janet said. But her current information is incomplete and could endanger active cases if it identifies specific locations or methods. Margaret spread out files on my coffee table. We currently have 18 families in various stages of relocation. If this story exposes our safe house locations or operational procedures, we'll have to shut down everything and start over. That means turning away people who desperately need help. The ethical dilemma was agonizing. Harold had spent 15 years building this network in secrecy, understanding that exposure could destroy it. But his death had created a vacuum without his central coordination and the trust he'd built. The network was struggling to maintain operations. Going public might bring donations and volunteers, but it could also bring unwanted attention from the violent men whose victims Harold had helped escape. What would Harold want us to do? I asked. David looked through his notes. Based on what I've learned about your husband's philosophy, I think he'd want us to find a way to honor the people he saved while protecting the people who still need saving. We spent the next several hours crafting a careful strategy. We would cooperate with Rebecca Martinez, but only under strict conditions. She could interview some of the families Harold had helped, but only those who were safe enough to speak publicly and willing to share their stories. She could discuss Harold's methods in general terms, but couldn't identify specific safe house locations or current operational details. We need to frame this as Harold's legacy story, not an expose of ongoing operations, Margaret explained. The focus should be on the man and his impact, not the technical details of how the network functions, Janet added, and we need to be prepared for the reaction. Once this story breaks, we'll get calls from other abuse victims seeking help, from donors wanting to contribute, and unfortunately, from some very dangerous people who won't like the attention. The next day, I met with Rebecca Martinez in a coffee shop downtown. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in her 30s, with an intensity that reminded me of Margaret, someone who'd found her calling in protecting the vulnerable. Mrs. Delaney, I want you to know that my goal isn't to sensationalize your husband's work, she said as we settled into a corner booth. I believe Harold's story needs to be told, but I want to tell it in a way that honors what he built and protects the people who are continuing his mission. Over the next 2 hours, I told Rebecca about discovering Harold's secret life, about the scope of his network, about the thousands of lives he'd touched. I showed her some of the thank you letters, carefully selected ones from people who'd already agreed to speak publicly about their experiences. I'm planning to focus on 3 main elements, Rebecca explained as our interview concluded. Harold's personal story as a quiet hero, the impact he had on specific families who are willing to be interviewed, and the broader issue of domestic violence and the gaps in our social safety net that made Harold's work necessary. As I drove home, I realized that Harold's story was about to become public knowledge. The man who'd spent 15 years working in shadows was finally going to receive recognition for his heroism, but more importantly, his work was going to inspire others to continue the fight against domestic violence. The only question now was whether the world was ready to learn about the accountant who'd saved thousands of lives, and whether his network could survive the exposure that recognition would bring. The newspaper article that appeared on the front page of the Phoenix Tribune 3 days later changed everything. Local business owners' secret life-saving thousands dominated the Sunday edition, complete with Harold's photograph and interviews with 5 families he'd helped over the years. Rebecca Martinez had crafted the story masterfully, balancing Harold's heroic legacy with the ongoing need for discretion. She focused on families who were now safe enough to speak publicly, while protecting current operations by keeping details deliberately vague. Harold Delaney appeared to be a typical retired accountant. The article began, driving a modest pickup truck and living quietly with his wife in suburban Phoenix. But for 15 years, Delaney operated an underground network that helped domestic violence victims disappear, relocating over 800 people and saving an estimated 3,000 lives. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, talk show producers, and documentary filmmakers wanting to interview me. The Sanctuary Solutions office was flooded with donation offers, volunteer applications, and requests for help from abuse victims across the country. Marcus called that afternoon, his voice filled with pride and amazement. "Vivian, I just read the article. The whole family has been calling each other. We had no idea Uncle Harold was famous. Everyone's talking about him at work, saying they knew Harold Delaney, that he was a hero." Harold's nephew wasn't the only family member whose perspective had changed. Jennifer posted the article on social media with a lengthy apology for her previous behavior and a tribute to Harold's courage. Dorothy started a fundraising campaign at her church, raising money to continue Harold's work. But the most meaningful response came from Harold's network itself. Sarah, the first woman Harold had helped 15 years ago, called to say she was flying in from Portland to attend a memorial service. Dr. Patricia Williams offered to provide free counseling services to any new families the network helped. Even some of Harold's former clients, now successful professionals, volunteered to fund new safe houses in Harold's memory. "This is exactly what Harold would have wanted," Margaret told me, as we sorted through dozens of donation checks that had arrived in the mail. "He always said the work was bigger than any one person, that it needed to grow beyond what he could accomplish alone." The story also attracted attention from law enforcement agencies that had secretly cooperated with Harold over the years. Detective Raymond Martinez, who'd taken Harold's reports about threats and harassment, spoke to Rebecca Martinez about Harold's collaboration with police. "Harold Delaney probably did more to combat domestic violence than our entire department," Martinez said in a follow-up article. "He filled gaps in the system that we couldn't fill legally, and he did it all while maintaining complete transparency with law enforcement when necessary." The media attention brought unexpected validation for Harold's methods. Legal experts, interviewed for the story, confirmed that Harold's network operated within the bounds of the law, providing services that were desperately needed but unavailable through traditional channels. What Harold Delaney created was essentially a private witness protection program for domestic violence victims, explained Professor Linda Chen, no relation to Margaret, from Arizona State University's Criminology Department. His methods were innovative, effective, and completely legal. He saved lives that the traditional system couldn't save. 3 weeks after the article appeared, I received a call that brought everything full circle. Jennifer Polk, the woman whose rescue had triggered Harold's fatal heart attack, had seen the story and wanted to meet me. "Mrs. Delaney," she said when we met for coffee, "I need you to know that your husband died saving my children and me. The day he authorized our relocation, my ex-husband was planning to kill us all. Harold's heart attack happened because he pushed himself to the limit to make sure we were safe." Jennifer's twins, now 8 years old, were thriving in their new home with their new identities. They were honor students, played Little League baseball, and had no memory of the violence that had once defined their lives. "I named my counseling practice after Harold," Jennifer continued, showing me a business card for Delaney Family Services. "I'm a licensed social worker now, helping other abuse victims. Every family I help is a tribute to your husband's legacy." As I drove home from that meeting, I realized that the newspaper article had accomplished something Harold himself could never have achieved. It had made his secret work public knowledge, inspiring others to continue and expand his mission, while giving credit where credit was due. The gold digger accusations that had haunted Harold's funeral seemed like ancient history now. Everyone who'd read the article understood that Harold's wealth had come from his business acumen, and that his true fortune had been measured in lives saved, not dollars accumulated. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt proud rather than guilty about the inheritance he'd left me. It wasn't money. I'd married him, for it was the legacy of a man who'd spent his life making the world safer for vulnerable people, one family at a time. Harold's desk nameplate now sat in the corner of what had become my home office, a simple brass rectangle engraved with Harold Delaney, CPA, that served as both memorial and motivation. 6 weeks after the newspaper article changed everything, I was learning that continuing Harold's mission required skills I'd never imagined needing at 72 years old. Margaret had been patient with my education, teaching me the intricate dance of coordinating rescues while maintaining operational security. The training was intensive learning to recognize genuine distress calls from potential security threats, understanding the legal complexities of interstate relocations, and mastering the emotional endurance required to hear story after story of human cruelty. The most important skill Harold developed, Margaret explained as we reviewed case files in my kitchen, was the ability to make quick decisions under pressure. When someone calls in crisis, you often have minutes to decide whether to mobilize resources or whether the situation is too dangerous to attempt. My first case came 3 weeks into training. A woman named Lisa from Tucson called the emergency line, whispering that her husband was escalating his violence and had threatened to kill her and their teenage daughter if she tried to leave. He was a corrections officer with law enforcement connections, making traditional protective services ineffective. "This is exactly the type of case Harold specialized in," Margaret said as we discussed Lisa's situation. "Official channels can't help because the abuser has inside knowledge of how the system works. We need to move fast and move carefully." The coordination required was staggering. We needed safe transportation from Tucson to Phoenix, temporary housing while we arranged permanent relocation, new identity documents for both Lisa and her daughter, school transfers that wouldn't leave a paper trail, and coordination with law enforcement officers we trusted to handle the situation discreetly. Harold always said the key was having multiple backup plans. Margaret coached me as I made the arrangements. If Plan A fails, you need Plan B, ready immediately. These women don't get second chances if we make mistakes. The Safe House Network responded beautifully. Linda, who'd shown me around the Phoenix facility, agreed to house Lisa and her daughter temporarily. Dr. Rebecca Chen offered to alter their appearances if necessary. James Crawford, the document specialist in Colorado, could have new identities ready within 72 hours. But the emotional weight of coordinating the rescue was unlike anything I'd experienced. As Lisa and her 16-year-old daughter Amanda arrived at the safe house, both bearing fresh bruises and carrying nothing but a single suitcase, I understood why Harold had kept me unaware of this work for so long. "Are we safe now?" Amanda asked me as I helped them settle into their temporary room. Her eyes held a wariness that no teenager should possess, the hypervigilance of someone who'd lived with violence for too long. "You're safe," I promised, though I knew that safety was something they'd have to learn to believe again over time. The successful relocation took 5 days. Lisa and Amanda were transported to Seattle, where Lisa had a new job waiting at a hospital, and Amanda could enroll in a new high school with transcripts that showed she'd always lived in Washington. Their former identities disappeared into Harold's system, leaving no trail for Lisa's husband to follow. "How do you handle the emotional toll?" I asked Margaret after we'd confirmed Lisa and Amanda were settled in their new lives. "You remember why we do this," she replied, showing me a text message that had arrived that morning. Look, the message was from Amanda, sent from her new phone with her new identity. "Started school today, made 2 friends already. Mom is smiling. Again, thank you for giving us our lives back." Harold's nameplate seemed to gleam in the afternoon light streaming through my office window. I was beginning to understand what had driven my husband to sacrifice so much: the incredible satisfaction of knowing that your actions directly translated into safety, hope, and new beginnings for people who had nowhere else to turn. "Harold would be proud," Margaret said as she prepared to leave. "You're a natural at this work, Vivian. You have his instincts for the strategic planning and his heart for the people we serve." That evening, I sat in Harold's chair now, reviewed the thank you notes that had already started arriving for our new operations. The money Harold had left me was being put to exactly the use he'd intended, and for the first time since his death, I felt like I was truly honoring his memory. The gold digger accusations seemed like a lifetime ago. I wasn't spending Harold's money, was investing it in continuing the work that had defined his character and would now define the rest of my life. The memorial plaque read, Harold Delaney, Guardian of the Vulnerable, in elegant bronze lettering, mounted on a simple granite stone in the memorial garden behind the community center, where we'd chosen to hold Harold's true funeral. 2 months after his burial, we were finally giving him the send-off he deserved. Over 300 people gathered that Saturday afternoon, a crowd that would have amazed Harold with its size and diversity. I recognized some faces from the photographs. Margaret had shown me women who'd been helped years ago, now successful professionals who'd traveled from across the country to honor the man who'd saved their lives. Sarah, Harold's first rescue case from 15 years ago, served as the master of ceremonies. Now a confident woman in her 40s, she bore no resemblance to the terrified victim who'd first sought Harold's help. Harold Delaney saved my life, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. But more than that, he taught me what courage looks like. Not the loud, showy kind of courage you see in movies, but the quiet courage of getting up every day and choosing to help people who can't help themselves. The testimonials that followed painted a picture of Harold that even I was still learning to recognize. Margaret spoke about his strategic brilliance and unwavering commitment. Dr. Patricia Williams described his compassion and the way he'd personally followed up on families years after helping them. Detective Martinez testified to Harold's integrity and his careful cooperation with law enforcement. But the most powerful speeches came from the people Harold had saved. Maria Santos, now a nurse practitioner, brought her teenage children to meet the family of the man who gave us our lives. Carmen, the woman I'd met at the safe house, spoke in accented English about Harold's kindness and his genuine concern for children's welfare. Senator Harold never made us feel like charity cases, Carmen said, tears streaming down her face. He made us feel like family, like we deserved to be safe and happy. Marcus had asked to speak on behalf of Harold's blood family, and his words reflected the transformation they'd all undergone since learning the truth. I stand here, ashamed of how we treated Harold's widow, and how little we understood about Harold himself, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. We thought we knew him, but we only knew the surface. Harold wasn't just our uncle, he was a hero who happened to be related to us. Vivian, thank you for sharing him with all these families. And thank you for forgiving us for not seeing what was right in front of us. Jennifer Polk spoke about Harold's final rescue, the operation that had cost him his life but saved her and her children. Harold died the way he lived, putting other people's safety ahead of his own. My boys are alive because Harold chose to save us instead of protecting himself. The most surprising attendee was Rebecca Martinez, the journalist whose article had brought Harold's story to public attention. She'd continued investigating domestic violence issues and had become an advocate for victims' rights. Inspired by Harold's example, Harold Delaney proved that one person can make a difference, Rebecca told the crowd. But more than that, he proved that ordinary people, accountants, teachers, nurses, retirees, can be heroes if they're willing to look beyond their own comfort and safety to help others. As the formal ceremony concluded, people lingered in small groups, sharing stories and memories. I found myself surrounded by children and teenagers who'd been saved by Harold's network, many of them now young adults who'd never known a world where they weren't safe. Mrs. Delaney, a young man, approached me as the crowd began to thin. I'm Michael Santos Maria's son. I was 3 when Mr. Harold helped us escape. I'm starting college next month to study social work because my mom told me stories about him my whole life. Similar conversations happened throughout the afternoon. Children Harold had saved were now choosing careers in service, becoming teachers, counselors, nurses, and social workers. His influence was multiplying exponentially as each person he'd helped went on to help others. The memorial plaque was officially unveiled as the sun began to set. Guardian of the Vulnerable seemed inadequate to capture the scope of Harold's impact, but it reflected the essence of who he'd been, a protector of people who couldn't protect themselves. As the last attendees departed, I stood alone in front of Harold's memorial, thinking about the man I'd been married to for 43 years without truly knowing, the husband who'd kissed me goodbye each morning while carrying the weight of life or death decisions, the partner who'd shared our bed while keeping secrets that could have gotten us both killed. Margaret appeared beside me as the evening light faded. Harold would have hated being the center of attention like this, but he would have loved seeing all these people together, I replied. All these families safe and thriving, all these children grown up and making their own positive impact on the world. The memorial service hadn't just honored Harold's memory, it had strengthened the network he'd built. New partnerships had been formed, additional resources had been pledged, and a new generation of advocates had been inspired to continue the fight against domestic violence. Harold's legacy wasn't just the lives he'd saved, it was the movement he'd started, the community of protectors he'd created, and the proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to look away from suffering. Harold's wedding ring hung on a gold chain around my neck, warm against my skin as I reviewed the quarterly reports that showed how dramatically our network had grown in the 6 months since his death. The simple gold band had become my talisman, a reminder that love could take many forms, including the courage to continue someone else's mission when your own heart was broken. The statistics were remarkable. We'd helped 43 families relocate since I'd taken over coordination with Margaret, more than double Harold's usual quarterly numbers. The publicity from Rebecca Martinez's articles had brought in donations totaling over $2 million, volunteer applications from across the country, and collaboration offers from established domestic violence organizations. We're going to need to expand our Safe House network, Margaret said as we met in what had become our regular Saturday morning planning session. The calls are coming in faster than we can handle them. Marcus had surprised everyone by taking early retirement and joining our operation full-time. Using his background in logistics to streamline our relocation procedures, his penance for the gold digger accusations had evolved into genuine passion for Harold's mission. I've identified potential safe house locations in 3 new cities, Marcus reported, spreading maps across my dining room table. Jennifer's church has offered to help with funding, and Dorothy's women's group has committed to providing volunteer support. Harold's entire family had become invested in continuing his work, but their involvement felt natural rather than obligatory. They'd discovered that helping others was addictive once you experienced the satisfaction of directly improving someone's life. It became impossible to return to purely self-focused existence. The transformation in my own life was equally dramatic. At 72, I'd found a purpose that made getting up each morning feel urgent and important. The grief for Harold remained, but it had been tempered by the knowledge that his work was not only continuing but expanding. Mrs. Delaney, my assistant, knocked on the office door. "There's a call from Seattle. It's Lisa, the woman we helped relocate 3 months ago." Lisa's voice was bright with news I'd been hoping to hear. "Vivian, I wanted to let you know that Amanda made the honor roll this semester, and I got promoted to head nurse in the pediatric unit. We're safe, we're happy, and we're building the kind of life I never thought we could have." Calls like Lisa's came regularly now, baits from families who'd been helped months or years ago. Children reporting graduation achievements, women sharing news of promotions or new relationships built on trust rather than fear. Harold's network had become an extended family, spanning multiple states and touching thousands of lives. The most rewarding development was seeing some of Harold's former clients become network supporters themselves. Sarah had established a foundation that provided college scholarships for children who'd been relocated through our program. Maria Santos had convinced her hospital to donate medical services for families in transition. Dr. Patricia Williams had recruited colleagues to provide pro bono counseling services. Harold always said the work needed to be sustainable beyond any one person, Margaret reflected as we reviewed our expansion plans. He'd be amazed to see how his vision has grown into something so much larger than what he originally imagined. The hardest part of continuing Harold's mission was making life or death decisions under pressure. Choices that Harold had handled alone for 15 years, but I'd discovered that I had more strength than I'd realized, and that the responsibility of protecting vulnerable people brought out capabilities I'd never known I possessed. Jennifer Polk had become one of our most effective advocates, speaking publicly about her experience and helping other abuse victims understand that escape was possible. Her sons, now 9 years old, were thriving academically and socially, with no memory of the violence that had once defined their lives. "Sometimes I think about the ripple effects," Jennifer said during a recent visit to Phoenix. "My boys will grow up knowing that people helped us when we needed it most. They'll understand that ordinary people can be heroes. That's a gift that will influence how they treat others for the rest of their lives." As I sat in Harold's chair that evening, reviewing thank you letters from our latest successful relocations, I touched his wedding ring and thought about the conversation we'd never had, the one where he would have explained his secret life and asked for my help instead of my ignorance. But perhaps that conversation had been unnecessary. Harold had shown me through his example what love really meant, just caring for the people close to you, but extending that care to strangers who desperately needed protection. He'd taught me that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in lives saved, children protected, and families given the chance to heal and thrive. The gold digger accusations that had haunted his funeral seemed like artifacts from another lifetime. Everyone who knew our story now understood that Harold's money had been earned through brilliance and invested in heroism. That my inheritance wasn't about material wealth but about carrying forward a mission that had defined the best of who he was. At 72, I'd discovered that it was never too late to find your calling, never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Harold had spent 15 years saving others while I'd lived in comfortable ignorance. Now I would spend whatever years I had left ensuring that his legacy of protection and courage continued to grow. The wedding ring against my chest pulsed with the rhythm of my heartbeat, a reminder that love doesn't end with death, it transforms into action, into service, into the determination to honor someone's memory by continuing their most important work. Harold Delaney had been called many things in life, but history would remember him as what he truly was: a guardian of the vulnerable, a protector of families, and a quiet hero whose greatest achievement was inspiring others to follow his example of sacrificial love.